Let's get into the nitty-gritty of creating classes. First of all, this is going to be the first time that you, personally you, are creating your own data type in C++. And you've heard me say this before, with great power comes great responsibility. But as long as you design it, and we've talked about some design issues, and we'll talk about some other design things you need to keep in mind later on, it's not all that bad. So remember that your variables are going to be instance of a class data type, and they're going to be called objects. Now, in our data members that we're going to have two different really sets of data members. One's going to be called attributes, and these can be of any data type. They can also be actually an object of another class. So that's one part. The other part of what we're going to have is data functions or member functions, called methods that you and I already know and love. And they're going to help basically work with the data members in any type of manipulation, retrieving, items like that in your overall class. So this next portion I talk about in great detail later, more of theory and design of it, but you're going to have two different types of visibility, and that's public and private. Now, private logistically can only, it's variables or methods that can be accessed from within the class, why it's called private. They're commonly used for most data members, and that's what default, or C++ defaults to. If you do not give it some type of visibility, it's going to be set to private. Whereas public can be accessed inside or outside the functions. Now, you're going to have some public functions. Not everything is going to be private, but you may have some public items. And again, that means you can access this from the main or outside of the class itself. And again, this can both be data members, data functions, all that stuff, member functions. I keep saying data functions, but member functions of that class. And that's really the interface of how you would get and set some of the values in the object that you and I are creating. And that's really what structs are, which we haven't seen yet, but you will in a minute. All of structs are totally public, so it's much easier to interface it because everything's public. But that also could be a bad thing, too. So let's start getting into the actual code of a class. First, we start off with class, and then the name of our object. Now, again, we really should have gone through the theory of the overall design of an object, what we want inside of it, and all that stuff first before we really get into the code. I know a lot of you still won't do that, but we'll start out with student. Notice that it's a capital S, and usually by convention, our objects that you and I are creating start with a capital letter. The other thing I want to point out here, that's not a typo with that semicolon at the end. I do it all the time, so just heads up. We do have a starting squiggly brace and a closing squiggly brace for now, but we'll move on to something more interesting, is that we go ahead and start laying out the visibility of what data members we're going to have inside, members and functions, inside of our object. It's good to start off with the private ones before public. You'll see private underneath there as well, but again, these are data members and member functions throughout the whole entire thing. And in some IDEs, you can actually set up your public and private data members, and it'll generate some of the code for you. So just a little hint, you may want to ask your instructor or TAs about that. But the important part is we're going to start laying out our public and private items. Notice with the tags, private and public. Now in C++, if you don't give it any of these tags here, it's going to by default set it to private. So let's show you some more here. So here we've gone ahead and started adding some data members. And notice it's not data functions or member functions because there's no parentheses behind them. But everything so far in all of these is going to be set to private. Name, an ID, grade, and letter grade. Public we'll get to eventually. Now that also means once we do all these other private members, we're going to need some other functions to go ahead and access these items so that we can change them. And we'll again talk more about that in theory, but that's coming up here in a moment. The other nice part about this is notice this single object of student now is very much heterogeneous. We have string, integer, double, character. It's like I talked about before, it's like a table with a whole bunch of data types, basic data types that you and I talked about before, merged into one. So that's why this is a heterogeneous data type that you are now creating. So now we've added a couple of data functions or member functions. Notice again with the parentheses behind it here. Now again, I told you they're probably going to be, well, interfacing with some of the data members that we've got. We have string get name, gee, I wonder what that's going to do, and void set name, gee, what I wonder that's going to do. Notice the names are pretty darn obvious, and we call them getters and setters, and we're going to have more of them eventually. But also notice, and that's the notice behind me here, is that these member functions are just declared, not defined. That's going to happen in our source file that I'll go over here in a little bit. But this is just the elementary stuff of getting the design out that's going to lead us to more of the functional coding behind the scenes. So your header file may not be super large because, again, we're just declaring these. We're not really defining them quite yet. So it might be kind of small, and that's okay. That's all right. Let's move on to the next. This is a for giggles type of thing. You'll notice I've expanded and now defined what those functions are going to be, but we've got a problem. Not really in the first one, because all we're doing is returning the name, and it knows this name because it's inside the class means this name right here. But this one over here is using name 3 times. I'm passing it in, I'm trying to set it to one, and I'm trying to set it to another. Yeah, as you can see the note over my shoulder here, this isn't going to work because it doesn't know which name is which. And that's because of the this item that we're going to use here in a moment, key word here that we're going to use in a moment to define which name are we really trying to change. Is it the variable name, or are we trying to change the data member of the class? Which one are we going to do? We'll show you. So here's the answer to that. If we want to change the name of this object, notice the word this and the arrow beside it, okay? So it knows that this variable name is going to match this, and it's going to then reset this object's name. So in reality, I could also have this arrow name, and it would know it was coming from the object itself. I could use this whenever I'm accessing this object's data members at the very beginning of this class. That would make sure that you know where exactly you're pulling that data from. Also, somebody might suggest, well, just change this name variable just a little bit, and I get you. Probably a great idea. But we wanted to go over the overall this naming of it, meaning the name or the values that are in this object. That's what we'd be accessing. The other part about this is that you'll notice we're defining all of the functions in here, which will work in C++, but what we normally do is I would yank these out and put them into a source file, which we'll go over here in a little bit. And again, these would be just the definitions of it instead of the whole defining and setting up all the values, function meat that we have inside of a class. That's usually pulled somewhere else. But again, like I said, this is all for giggles so far. Now this is what I should see. Notice that this function, I know you see the scope operator, the scope resolution operator, and I'll go over that here in a second. But notice that this grouping of code, literally from a hand down, is outside of the class. Now, that physically could be outside in the same file or outside in another file called a source file. We'll go over that here in a minute. But notice it's physically outside. The next part is that scope resolution operator. In reality, we could have multiple classes in a single file. We could have multiple classes that also have the same getName function. I'm going to use an example here in a moment. I'm flying here in a little bit as a passenger. We could have a getName function for a totally different class. So we are making sure we understand that this personal getName function belongs to the student. That's already been declared inside of the class itself, so you knew that these two are tied together using that scope resolution operator. And this is how it all ties together when we create our overall class, get everything ready to go, and then create our instance. So notice, I'm not saying by default, but we use this a lot. Inside of main, we're going to create our student. Now here's the neat part about it. If you did your class right, it doesn't have to be theoretically all done yet, and we'll talk about more theoretics and design later. But if you at least got the code right, your compiler is now going to understand that there now is a student data type that you created. That's the neat part about this whole thing. So you have power of creating your own data types. So we create an instance of our new data type called student named Joe. We're going to set the name of it, and then string name joe.getName. That's going to return the name back to a new variable called name as well. So you can see that we're accessing Joe's getName by using the access attribute or method using a dot operation to get that information. So it knows it's getting Joe's information by using Joe dot, and in a lot of IDEs, the individual functions or items that you have access to will pop up, and getName should be one of them since getName is public. So pretend with me for 1 second. Let's pretend we had one item that was in the private section. This is called function, destroy student. If it was private, I would not be able to access it from the main. We would have Joe dot, and that destroy student wouldn't be there. It would not have access to it because it is a private data member, a private function, and main does not have access to that. So that's the other neat part about information hiding when we get into, well, using our classes.